I'm going to show you a number of projects and places that I've been over the years. And I'm going to begin with Kohler, which most of you know. The Kohler company manufactures plumbing fixtures, toilets, bathtubs, sinks, etc. But they have a remarkable residency program for artists, which one has to apply for. And there are about 18 people a year that are awarded a residency, and they can be either in the ceramic department of the Kohler company, or they can be in the iron foundry portion of the company. And the residencies generally are up 3 to 4 months, sometimes 6 months in length. And I was there for 4 months. Anyway, let me begin that process. This is how close you get to the actual metal pouring. So what you see in this bright glow is iron at 2,500 degrees, which is looking like hot milk. It's that color. And this is a mold that I made. You have to do your own mold making, your own pattern making, etc. But the assistants at the foundry will interrupt the line of pouring whatever they're pouring and pour your molds. So this was one of the pieces that came out of that, which I call periodic gaze, and it's basically the metallic elements that I've worked with. It's about 4 feet by 7 feet, and each element is about 12 by 12. So I will take you through this process. Here's a detail shot of it. And my intention was that it would look something like excavated land, something like topography or terrain. And so you can see how the edges kind of step down, and that the symbol for the material, in this case iron, rises like a butte in the middle. All this work was done, I did it in AutoCAD in computer, but then it had to be translated into a computer language to run a CNC machine, and the Kohler factory helped me with that work. So for Kohler, you wonder, well, why does Kohler want to become involved in that? And one of the reasons is they're very supportive of the arts. They have an art center in Sheboygan that's remarkable. And then the other reason is that it changes the whole atmosphere of the factory when you have artists that are there. And I'll show you a number of examples of some of the things I had done. So typically, they're not machining things like this. You know, they're machining parts for tubs or whatever it is. These are the actual parts that are machined. They're called the pattern, and they're made in a plastic called redboard. And I kept all the patterns and used those for another piece, which I called blood. Obviously they're red, but symbolically those metals are the earth. Chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and then this is what the surface. It's almost like combed hair or disked land. So it has a kind of an agrarian feeling to the surface of these pieces. And these are the molds. So once you have the pattern, then you ram sand around that pattern, and then extract, this being a negative space now, which can be filled with iron or any metal. And this is what resulted from the mold. There's 2 elements on each layer of this. This is called a book mold. It's many molds stacked up so you can just do one pour. And this is typically what it looks like. There's metal going everywhere. And of course, you have safety gear on, but nevertheless, there's spatter everywhere. because once the mold overflows, which it has to do, you see right in here, then of course once it hits the floor it's all over the place. And this is a process of cooling, and then there's the result. These were other pieces that I did where trying to use the idea that as metal moves across a surface, that if you thin it or you modify it in such a way, the metal will freeze. So imagine that you have some kind of a plumbing system around the perimeter. So that would be this frame. And then the metal goes into that frame, and then it slowly moves across the picture plane, but the picture plane is squeezed, and then the metal freezes. As a result, I had no control over what happened on the picture plane. In other words, whatever went on in there was the result of physics and the temperature of the metal and whatever was going on. But there was only artistic intention, but not real control. It's a very indirect kind of process. So here's an example of one of the pieces, and I'll show you some others, where every one of them is different. All the conditions were identical. The molds were identical. The melt was identical. And so they have a characteristic of some kind of aerial photograph of topography, and maybe something like lakes on these surfaces. And then you'll notice some very, very fine lines. These are the cold shuts where the material's coming across and then it freezes when it intersects with the other. And these colors, these changes of color, are the result of a change of the actual core of the metal. The metal is changing from a ductile iron into a more brittle type of iron. So this isn't a facade. This is what actually is at the core. And then there was another series. The first series was called the flow pieces. These are called the fractures. So these are smaller. They're 18 by 18. And these negative shapes that you see are the result of this picture plane actually formed all the way across, but it included some inclusions or cracks. And so let's just say I helped things along with a sledgehammer and created even more of a fracture. And the thing that was most interesting to me were these shapes, which in many ways were no less planned than the flow pieces. It's a little bit like if you were to take paper and start tearing it, looking for shapes, and not really precisely drawing it with a line. It's an interesting way to arrive at things that you probably wouldn't have discovered had you sat down with a pencil and tried to draw shapes. So sometimes dropping a plate will give you a result that's beneficial. And by the way, the surface of these, and you can see a texture to that. And basically what that is wafer board. So in other words, in order to make the mold, you have to have some kind of positive shape. And so the sheets and fragments of wafer board gave that texture. Another thing I did, and I'm going to concentrate on this on the workshop on Friday, is one of the ways to understand something is to section it. So in other words, you take whatever you have, it could be an onion, it could be an apple, it could be a school bus, and you saw it in half or cut it in half. And whatever is revealed with that cut is very different than what you knew before. And architects and designers, interior designers use sectioning all the time, as do machinists. There's many professions that use this. And what these are, this is actually a sink. This is a Kohler sink that was sawed. So this line, this positive shape, is a portion of the sink. So this is the rim folding over down to what would be the drain. And this piece is the result of taking sections of sinks and then coordinating that into a line drawing. And that drawing was laser cut. So I know you're getting a laser cutter so you can do something like this. And by the way that I did it is very roundabout. You have a much more direct way here. So what we have is all the positive and negative shapes, or sometimes called the drops, from a laser cutting operation. And then I did it the hard way. I took a router and actually cut into this to make a pattern. You can see how it's dropped down in this area. And you have a CNC router in the sculpture department. I could come back and use it if you want. So this is the process to yield this pattern. And so it's a thick piece of plywood with this pattern on it. And all of this business on the outside is the plumbing that's necessary to allow the iron to go into the mold. Because if you have the piece in the middle of the mold and no way to get the iron in, nothing's going to happen. So the iron will come in here, go down here, and then go in several areas on that side, and then it'll rise up in the mold from these pieces. This piece was not that big, but once you start getting larger with your castings, you have to have tremendous amounts of sand to back it up because the iron's so hot. And so at that point, you have to have huge cranes to move it, because this represents 1/2 of the mold to do this. I wouldn't do it again, by the way, that way. I wouldn't do it that way. And then here's the piece being removed from the mold. This is the actual casting, so this is iron now. That's just excess sand on it, and then this is the piece. When you're in the factory, you see a lot of sinks. These are all cast iron. Bathtubs, things like that. And Kohler, you may use any of that production as long as you alter it. So in other words, you can't enamel a bathtub for your house. you have to cut it in half or you have to do something to it. Anyway, I had no intention at all to use any Kohler product. I had other things on my mind, but when you're walking by this stuff every day, there is that point where something occurs. And I was looking at these bathtubs and realized that with one cut, I could have something that looked like a Corbusier chair. And so they will only give you usually tubs that have some damage to them. And so out of every tub, I got 2 chairs. And then what the heck? Why not enamel them? So those are the cut sections of the tub. And if you want to enamel it, you have to build a fixture to hold it. Because as many of you know, the enamel is a powder. And in fact, at Kohler, they refer to it as powdering. You want me to powder this thing? Yes. And you have to build a fixture. And this goes into a device that will turn it so that gravity works with the powder. In other words, you can't powder a vertical surface. You can only powder one that's somewhat horizontal. Okay. This is how it works at Kohler. These guys do nothing all day but powder sinks, tubs, etc. There are robot lines at Kohler, but they only do the white tubs. All the colored stuff is done by a team. And there are 2 ovens. One is a preheat oven, and that's at about 1,500 degrees. Your product goes into that, brought up to a certain temperature. It's brought out with this machine, which is like a train, electric train, with forks on it. And then it's put into the higher heat oven, which is about 1,800 degrees. And if you look carefully, you can see the fixture device right here. So it goes something like this. You go into one oven, talk a little bit. It starts warming up. Then you bring it out, you put it in the hotter oven, and you get it up to the final temperature. Then it's brought out. Do you see the difference in the color? See the piece going in? Kind of a red color and a yellow, and it goes up to much higher heat. Put into the fixture. He's got the powder and his heat shields on, and then starts. And that's what you get. I chose the 50s colors. More of the pastel. I think the green is called something like seafoam green. Just perfect. There was a lot of tile. If you've ever lived in a 50s house, you got seafoam green. And then the other part of the tub, I just let them rust and made some legs for them, and so there's that version as well. And by the way, the other end of the tub, if you've ever, and I don't know if you've ever really spent time looking at a bathtub, but it slopes. It's got a drain, right? So the chairs that come from one end, there's a little bit of a slip to them. But this end is actually preferable because this is the lower end and it'll hold you in better. And then the other part of, it's one of those things that it occurs serendipitously, but the floor in a foundry and in a factory is just covered in grit. And most of it is some kind of iron oxide or grinding dust. And I realized that this stuff was everywhere. It was on my shoes. And I did a piece where they run tours through the factory. And by the way, if you ever go to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, you drive 5 miles to Kohler and you should go on the factory tour because there's nothing like it, and you can get within 100 feet of molten iron. It's a family company. You want to come in? Sure. And they'll take you to every part of the operation. It's just fascinating. Anyway, in the tours walking through, I realized if I put a piece of paper on the ground, that just them walking through would imprint treads on the paper. So in other words, it would be whatever the pattern is on the bottom of your shoes. Anyway, you can do the same thing with a forklift, except it's like a printing press. So I started working with the drivers, put a piece of mat board with a piece of paper on the top of it, and then would have them drive over it. And initially, well, first of all, they'd never done this before, nor had I. And they were, they weren't sure what they should do. And I said, well, I'll put the paper down and then just drive over it and we'll kind of work to see what happens. Anyway, by the time I left, I've got a great story about this. This one driver, I think I've got a picture of her. That's Dave, who was one driver. But there was also Angela. And so Angela started doing some prints, and one day late in the afternoon I saw her and I said, hey, I'm going to put some paper together and let's do some work tomorrow. Is that okay? And because you want to check with their schedule. And she said, oh yeah, that'd be great, that'd be great. And anyway, I didn't get over to her shift until very late in the shift. And when she saw me, she said, oh, I'm so glad you're here. I told my husband we were going to do prints today. So pretty soon, I simply put the paper on the ground and said, do whatever you want. And they really got into it. They were totally into this process. So these are some of the prints. This is one of my favorites. It's a very large forklift, and all of those white spaces are the burns from the metal going everywhere. So they're negative space on the wheel or the tire of the machine. So you can do printmaking in your driveway. And these shifts in value, where it gets much darker in these areas, is a result of going over the drawing multiple times. So you have all the same conditions of value, shift, atmosphere, the things that you attribute to a drawing. This is another project and came out of an interest, again, in the sectioning. The acanthus, of course, has been around for centuries and is a decorative ornament. And you see it on a lot of classical buildings, Corinthian capitals. There will be these leaves at the top, and they are acanthus leaves. And in this case, these happen to be 19th century cast iron acanthus leaves. And a friend of mine gave me a box of them. And of course, what are you going to do with acanthus leaves? About the same time, I was in Athens, and you begin to realize how many acanthus leaves were made by multiple cultures. And when you're in the Mediterranean, you begin to realize that the acanthus is a very common plant. It's a weed. So this is an acanthus. And the leaves. And these capitals are Greek, they are Roman, and the idea of the acanthus spread throughout Asia, Asia Minor, It became what's commonly known as the arabesque. It's something that is ubiquitous. It's spread around the world as a pattern. And there's one that I particularly like. This is a capital. It's marble and carved. But in this one, you have the capital itself with more columns and acanthus within it. So you have the actual architectural detail, but you have an image of the architectural detail within it. So a repeat. Whenever I get into anything, as I know you all do, I get every book that I can possibly get and study it as much as I can. And so I decided to take the leaf, saw it on a bandsaw, and I was really, really surprised when I saw this shape. I never would have thought of that shape. I wouldn't have drawn that shape. And so I kept cutting the leaf. I thought, well, man, there's got to be more. And so there were. There were all these. And then I took a rubber stamp pad, inked the sawn part, and made an inventory. It's like a letter set. Just an inventory of shapes. And look how varied they are. They're hieroglyphics. They're sign systems. And then I started making drawings using the rubber stamp and the cut parts. Didn't really know that they would end up being a gate or a door, but I make a lot of gates and doors. And so I just kept making drawings of the potential. And none of these could really be built, but it didn't matter. And then a client came and said, "What are you working on?" I said, "Well, I've got this acanthus thing going." They said, "Well, could you make some gates? Do you think that would work?" I said, "Yeah, I think I can figure that out." And so the next step was to see if I could sketch larger and in full size. So all of the acanthus shapes, put them in the computer, blew them up, laser cut cardboard. And there's a choice that every one of you makes, I think probably every day. And you do it so often, you don't even think about it. But the choice is portrait or landscape. Every day. Print, portrait or landscape. So look at this. Portrait, landscape. Or maybe some kind of graph of heartbeats. In other words, we don't really know they're acanthus anymore, even though it's connected. Portrait, landscape, EKG. And now a process of sketching, putting these things on a wall. And what can it be? One of the things that I found problematic, if you look at these doors, you see how thick this portion is when you get two door frames together? And I thought, it's a problem. So what would happen if I slice away at that, such as this? So now it has more of a parenthetical bracket of this, which is the way they were built. The other great thing about digitized information is you can make it at any scale. So while I am working in full scale, I'm also working in model scale. So in terms of putting this piece together, I'm working on the model and simultaneously working on the finished piece. In other words, I didn't have a drawing precisely of where parts were going to go. So here's the gates in a frame being started. And then the model. And then another model. Here's some work over a longer period of time. This is a model. I make a lot of scale models, and I do make them to scale. They're all made in metal. And there's a couple things that are important about that. Is I find that presenting a client or an architectural review committee with a model is far more powerful than a drawing. That's not to say that renderings and drawings aren't important, but when there's a physical object there and the physical object is exceptionally well made, it does more than simply present its form. When someone sees something that is beautifully made with a great deal of attention to detail, they will make the assumption that their project will receive the same level of attention. In other words, things communicated that are not necessarily in a drawing, because the physicality of a drawing is different. It is paper and ink, whereas this is metal and wood. And then there's the project. And people ask me why I photograph it in the winter, and the reason is that during the summertime, this is in an area where there's a lot of foliage and a lot of planting, and during the summertime and during the spring, these gates recede and the garden dominates. But during the winter, the fence becomes the garden. It's the most active part of it. So it has hollyhock doors, grasses, brick patterns, rock patterns. It is clearly a garden ornament. This is another gate, a perspective gate. And when I first thought of making this, by the way, there have been perspective gates made before, and very often they're in churches from the 17th century, sometimes 18th century. And when you think about perspective, and I know you've all done perspective drawings, you never look at the other side of a perspective drawing. In other words, it's the front side of the page. So a gate doesn't operate that way. You have to see both sides. So a model was really essential after the drawing, because I really didn't know what the other side was going to look like, even though it would be reciprocal. In other words, if you hammer on this side, you get something on the other side. And so here it is. These are about 1 inch in diameter, and the piece is probably about 9 feet tall. So there's incredible detail in it. And this piece sits in front of the walkway that's in the gate. So the gate tells you where you're going. This is another model, scaled, and these are the entrance gates at Cranbrook. Excuse me. And there are many gates at the greater Cranbrook community, and they include Gothic Revival gates of the 19th century, some Art Deco gates from the 30s. And so the idea was to somehow take all of that into account and then decide whatever the next step was. And at one time, this looks a bit like a briar patch with more structure in this area, or a spider web perhaps, something more organic. And at the same time, it still includes the perspective idea in these lines. And it also has something of a globe feeling to it, almost like a mapping. So it's much more abstract, and it also has things that one can identify. And then, of course, this is the piece. It's on 3 different layers, and when you're on site, the further you get away from it, the more it disappears. And it's only when you start to move towards it where the thickness becomes visible that it gains in visual density. You might also want to notice that even though these lines follow the same trajectory, the lines vary. So if you look at this glyph, and then you look at its occurrence on this side, they're different. Every negative space in this gate is different. There's none that are the same. That's a Gothic device. You look at rosettes on Gothic cathedrals, and none of them are the same, even though they appear to be. It's a way to build depth into something. Whatever you see the first time is not what you see the next time upon closer inspection. Work ought to have depth. In other words, one visit isn't going to be enough. This was a proposal. It was never built. Scale model. A driveway gate with a large rock. It's a bronze fabrication. And that's a corkscrew hazel branch. So the roadway would be in this area. And it pivots on this one point and opens. Another proposal that were a large set of bronze doors in the form of rocks, and that was not built either. But models are easier to build than actual pieces. This was a large installation in the mid-90s at the Detroit Institute of the Arts. It's called The Garden. And these have the layout of a formal garden. The murals that are in this area in the garden court are Diego Rivera murals, and they were commissioned by Edsel Ford, who was the son of Henry Ford, to make murals of Detroit industry. And these murals are just remarkable. So in the murals you can see the workers in the factory, and nearly every part of the Ford Rouge plant is pictured in these murals. If you notice in these areas, you'll see these lines, these kind of ribbony lines going through the murals, and those lines frame different sections of the factory. So one might include the foundry, one might include the drop forge, and these are actually drawn as conveyor chains. So they thematically work as something that goes through the factory, but they also serve a formal device of framing the piece. And I was able to find in a junkyard precisely the same conveyor chain. And so these beds are a combination of the conveyor chain that's in the mural, and then the bed or the mulch are called frags. And frags there's huge scrapyards in Detroit, as you can imagine. And they have a machine, a fragmenter, that is like a giant Cuisinart. And basically you just throw a car in, or two, and this thing will chop it up, separate the rubber from the glass, and then produce these frags. And the frags then are sent downriver to the smelters where they're turned into new steel. And I'm sure the percentage is higher, but at this period of time in 1995, 60% of every piece of new steel is scrap. So if you think about your car, think of what year it is. Okay? Now, it could be a clunker, but let's say it's a newer car. All right? The bottom line is, even though you're driving a new car, it's still scrap. 60% of it, coat hangers, washing machines, doesn't matter what it is. Anyway, the idea of it was that in the modern world, 60% of the mine of the ore is actually on top of the earth. It's not below the ground. It's up here. This is a smaller gate early on, which uses a Western and Midwestern theme with, the doors include roses and rose branches, and then there's on the post or the hinges, there's a cap gun, cowboy boot, grain silos, and then on the other side, I don't have the other side, but it's a corn crib. So these were very narrative pieces, storytelling kinds of pieces. Mid-'80s. This is a garden gate. It's all steel, it's fabricated, and really is sited in a garden and is about the garden. So you have a pile of rocks from gardening, garden tools, a potted fig plant, and the garden harvest in the doors. And another smaller gate, similar kinds of themes of landscape and narrative. And so one of the things you can see in the work is that there's all these different ideas, radically different kinds of responses, anything from very representational to abstract. And it's simply a matter of curiosity. In other words, do you want to keep doing the same thing or do you want to change? And it's a question that all artists answer differently. This is a just kind of an interesting sequence of this idea of the twist. So in other words, iron can be twisted and it's a common process. So this column is a piece of twisted channel iron, and then this capital area is actually the sections of this column. So let me show you. There's the detail of the capital, what I call the capital of this. And this is the twisting of the iron. So eventually it closes up and then it can be hammered to straighten it out. But it can also be cut. So here's the twisted column. And once you saw this, then you get these two sections in every one of those. And those can be something else. So those are the sections. And it results in this. Some table projects, 5 minutes. Okay, when I'm done with the tables, then I'm done. This was a commission, and the idea was that the client wanted something that looked more rusticated and earthy and something like the woods of Michigan. And so this table has rocks, acorns, oak leaves, sections of logs, but the finish is such that it almost looks like a Michigan birch type of wood, which maybe would be more like a cottonwood down here, a kind of white color, which comes from, you can see the difference in the color of this, and that metal has been tinned, molten tin is wiped over it, and then some areas are blackened, some areas are rusted, so it has a very woody, organic color. I do a lot of sketches of botanicals, and in fact, I did a table that was kind of a series of grasses, but the person that commissioned this did flower arrangements. And she said, I want you to go out in the garden and I want you to make in iron parts of all these things. And I'm going to put them underneath the table, and then when I need them for flowers, I'm going to put them on the top. And so this was an ash branch, and this was the table. So you have to imagine these things scattered underneath here, where you could see them because of the glass top, but then at certain points they came to the top. Cattail table. This is a wheat field table, bronze wheat heads. This is a large dining table. The top on this is 1 inch thick and 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. It sits on top of this big frame, and is a pile of steel rocks on one end with a book that's inserted, and that's the symbol for hematite, which is iron ore. And this kind of crystalline structure, looking cambrial legs. How are we doing?
Perfect, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, now you get to see. Okay, fire screen. This is a dogwood fire screen, St. Louis. And I did not choose the theme, but I did choose the idea that the fire screen could contain 4 seasons of dogwood. And one of the things, in other words, where do you want to start? You want to start in the spring? You want to start in the winter? Well, what I did was the fire in most cases is in the middle. And the fires are usually lit by most people during the winter. So whatever we put in the middle should be a symbol of that period of time, and should also, fortunately, is the most sparse. So you can see the fire. So you can see that the denser portions are on the outside of the screen. And a fire tool set went with it with a spray of the dogwood flowers. Those are all forged, by the way. This is another set, and look how different this is. This is far more rusticated. It's made out of rocks, hatchets, all steel, logs, broken pieces, what appear to be broken pieces of wood, and a matchbook. So this is like a campfire set. This is a grapevine fire screen, or not a fire screen. It's oh no, it is a fire screen. Sometimes, anyway, it's all forged iron. I think that's it. Thank you.